All right, so we're continuing the hermeneutics course, and today we're going to look at law and covenants. And this really has some implications for us. There's a lot of people who are confused about what parts of the law we still have to keep and what parts of the law we do not have to keep. And so we're going to talk about
Hi.
implications. Hey, Katie.
Hello.
And so this really turns into a discussion of do we have to keep the Lord's Day, for example? Do we have to, or do we have to worship on Saturday, like in the Old Testament? Do we have to abstain from certain foods? Um, do we still have to tithe? That was a part of the priest system. So these are really relevant discussions. So what parts of the law do we still keep? And what parts are no longer relevant to us? Or maybe how do they look a little different? So that's what we'll be talking about. And we're going to start out by watching two videos. Yay, we get to watch videos in class. Now, sometimes there's a challenge in pulling up videos, but we'll see if there's any fight about this. So first, we're going to start with a video on covenants. And it looks like it's showing. I had all kinds of fighting to get this thing to work, but we got it. And I can find a start button.
Covenant is a contract or an agreement. In the Bible, covenants are made between God and his people. There are 8 covenants in the Bible.
Can you hear that pretty good through there? So. You may have to
Yeah,
get up close.
I turned mine up a little bit.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if I can turn it any louder.
Understanding these covenants is the key to understanding the entire meta-narrative of God's purposes and ultimate will for his people. Let's take a look. The Edenic covenant. The key word here is the word rule. In Genesis 2:15, right after God had created.
So it's called Edenic for the Garden of Eden. So these fancy terms usually have a root. So that's the Garden of Eden. When they say Adamic, it's Adam. So just cut out the last part of the word and you'll understand what they're talking about.
Man, he put him in the garden and told him to care for it. From the very beginning, God's eternal purpose for man was to rule and enjoy him forever. Psalm 8 says, you make him to rule over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet. David was saying, you've made something from nothing. You're powerful. And you've made man ruler over your creation to show your glory. But man rebelled and forsook his position. We all know the story. Adam ate from the tree that God told him not to eat and brought sin into the world. The penalty for sin was death because God would not let man live eternally in his sin. So man lost it. We will need a second Adam to reclaim God's original purpose for man to rule, but only after he redeems man from his sin. Which brings us to the next covenant. Number 2 is the Adamic covenant. The chief word here is the word redemption. So because of Adam's sin, God curses man, animals, and the earth so it will yearn for his redemption. So immediately after sin occurs, God tells us how he will deal with it. Genesis 3:15, God reveals his unconditional covenant and his curse upon the serpent by saying, I will put enmity between you and your seed, meaning Satan, and the woman's seed, meaning Jesus. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Satan will inflict minor damage on Christ through crucifixion, but Christ will inflict major damage on Satan by defeating the curse of death. Jesus is the only one who can accomplish this because he will be born of the Holy Spirit, incarnated, going around the curse, born without man's sin. As time went on, man's newfound sin deteriorated into a sick and depraved wasteland of evil until every intent and thought on his heart was wicked. And God said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created. And that took place in Genesis 6, verse 7. Number 3 is called the Noahic covenant. The key word here is the word restraint. This covenant shows an attribute of God that we can be grateful for, and that is his restraint. For instead of blotting out the entire human race, he preserved Noah and all the animals in the ark and restrained his wrath, partly because of his mercy, but also partly because of his covenants, which he cannot change. Then in Genesis 8:21, God makes a covenant that he will never again destroy all living creatures, and gave Noah and the earth the rainbow as a sign of that covenant promise. But man would soon turn back to sin in an effort to make a name for himself at the Tower of Babel, where we see the introduction of other gods. So God scattered them among the nations to begin a new nation for himself. Our fourth covenant is called the Abrahamic covenant. The key word here is the word restore. In Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3, God chooses one man through whom he will restore his people to himself, Abraham. And in that covenant, God promises him three things. In verse 1, he promises him land. In verse 2, he promises him a people. And in verse 3, he promises him blessing. The land was Israel, the people were the Jews, and the blessing is they will be the touchstone of God towards all the people of every nation to know of him through them, to bless those who bless you and to curse those who curse you. And God made good on his promise too, because as the nation grew greatly, Egypt enslaved them, and God saw their affliction and cursed Egypt greatly through Moses and brought them safely out in the Exodus. Our fifth covenant is called the Mosaic covenant. Key word here is the word reveal. Now that Israel had grown to a great multitude of people, God brought them to Mount Sinai to make a covenant. This covenant was to serve as a temporary supervisor, teaching the righteous standards of God and reveal man's sin until the coming of Christ. In Leviticus 26, God tells Israel in verse 1, have no other gods. Verse 2, keep the Sabbath. Verse 3, keep his laws and commandments. So while the first four covenants were only up to God, the Mosaic covenant has conditions for man. And through those conditions, man will have his sin revealed and he will see the need for a sacrifice. The Mosaic covenant was temporary until Christ fulfilled every requirement of it, living perfectly and dying as the perfect sacrifice for the sins of all who believe. The sixth covenant is called the Palestinian covenant. Its key word is return. Well, the old guys died and the young guys forgot the Mosaic covenant and didn't keep God's laws. So in Deuteronomy 29, God tells them that they will not keep his covenant. And in Deuteronomy 30, verse 2 and 3, he tells them, come back to me. Because when they do, and verse 4 and 5 reminds them of what God promised in the Abrahamic covenant, land, seed, and blessing. In verse 6, something more, a new heart, which hasn't happened yet until Christ returns and gathers them to a new land. The seventh covenant is called the Davidic covenant. The key word here is the word reign. After 500 years of judges chaotically administering God's law, God appointed a king named David. King David loved the Lord with all his heart, and in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16, God makes a covenant with David that he will give David's son Solomon three things. Number 1, a throne. Number 2, a house. And number 3, a kingdom forever. After David died, Solomon received the benefit of this covenant with the most prosperous kingdom in Israel's history. But the covenant promise was forever, and Solomon eventually died. So this covenant had a second meaning, to reveal David's greater son of another nature, Jesus Christ, who would be from David's royal line 490 years later. The eighth covenant was called the New Covenant. Key word here is the word regenerate. After David and after many evil kings in Israel and Judah, God sends Israel into exile into Babylon. But before he does, he promises them in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 27 through verse 34, that he will bring them back one day and give them, and God invents a term here, he will give them a new covenant. In verse 32, God says they have been like babies needing their hand held. But in verse 33, one day they will be sons with new hearts, like a Jewish boy going through bar mitzvah, becoming a man. This is Israel's bar mitzvah. The law was for babies, teaching them about their sin. Grace is for sons of God, with the law written on their hearts. John the Baptist said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. It hasn't happened to Israel yet, but Jesus spoke of this new covenant at the Last Supper for the church as we were grafted in. So We got their king and their covenant. And in verse 34, God will forgive everything they've done. The Christian's purpose doesn't cast aside Israel, but makes Israel jealous until the second coming of Jesus, when all the covenants will be fulfilled and God's purpose from the very beginning for his children to rule and enjoy him forever will be accomplished once and for all.
All right. Pretty interesting stuff. So you have a cartoon, but there's really solid theology in there. And I'm glad I found this one. So, first of all, most people talk about 5 covenants, but in here, and because of our class is advanced, we wanted to cover all 8 covenants. And then what do you see that is in common with all these covenants? What are some things that are elements that are found in every covenant mentioned?
We all started.
Rule, redemption, restraint, restore, yeah.
Land, people, and blessing, I think. I'm trying to make sure it's in all of them. Oh, maybe it's not in all of them. Just
Yeah,
kidding, I
so-
take it back.
So land and a people and a blessing. Yeah, so those are promises from God. And so that's in every covenant. There are things that are promised as benefits of keeping the covenant. So,
And that
yeah,
people break them all, don't they?
yeah, well, they screwed it up. And so
Yeah.
they kept screwing it up. And then you notice that with every covenant, they ended up ruining their relationship with God and destroying the covenant. And so each time God turned his back on people who were unfaithful, it was like a divorce. And so, in fact, I think in Malachi, or another Old Testament passage, I didn't look it up, God talks about divorcing his people. And so that is very interesting that they screwed up every covenant. And
How are they all going to be fulfilled?
yeah, well, so that's a really good question. So what you see is that all of these covenants point to the future. So you see, or most of them do. You see in Eden that sin and death came in. And then with Adam, you see an answer to sin. So he points to a new covenant that God will establish. He'll work it out. He'll find a way to restore a covenant. And the promise all the way back in Genesis 3 is that Satan would bruise his heel, speaking of the crucifixion, but then Jesus is going to stomp on his head and get rid of him. And so that mostly is done at the resurrection, where Satan no longer has power over people that he tricked into falling.
Mhm.
And of course, then there's a screw up where he's calling a people to follow him, and there's still each one going their own way. So you end up with Noah and a promise to never destroy the earth again and all people. But that really has its fulfillment in that God will prevent people from falling into a moral situation where all people are totally lost. And the only way that can happen and was fulfilled is when Jesus gives us a new heart at the new birth. And so that's the only way that that's fulfilled. Otherwise, all people would not be covered for sin. And then Abraham is promised land, people, and blessing. And he's also given faith to believe God for these things. And so he was justified by faith. Hebrews tells us that he was justified by faith. So that points forward. And then we have the Mosaic covenant. Now, this was very interesting that the Mosaic covenant was a temporary restraint on evil. So the law and all the components of it were a temporary measure to reveal sin and to keep sin at bay. And so the Mosaic law has a few different components, and we'll go through that in a few minutes here. But it's interesting that people still take the Mosaic law, which has it's organized around a temple, around priests that bring sacrifices to God, and so there's a whole temple system that involves temple sacrifices, rituals, rules, and part of those temple rules include tithing, like the legal tithe is a part of that covenant. Notice that that wasn't a part of any other covenant. It was a temporary covenant put in place to reveal evil and restore. And then you have the Sabbath. That was a part of a temporary covenant.
Could I ask a question quick?
Yeah,
What covenant was the one with the tithing?
Mosaic, the Moses. So that's the Ten Commandments plus all the temple rules, 600 of them. So you have the Sabbath, Saturday only. That's a part of their ceremonies were organized around Saturday and Sabbath and so forth. You have tithing and clean and unclean foods and clean and unclean things. You couldn't wear certain things and go to the temple. You couldn't be in an unclean, ritually impure condition. And so you had to go to a temple, and God was in this temple. And so all these rules were governed for feeding the priests, taking care of the priests, taking care of sacrifices. And so that was a temporary measure. So it's interesting that we take components of a temporary covenant given through Moses and we apply it to today when we're under a different covenant. So if we have a different covenant, then there's different stipulations that were given to us.
Okay, but the Ten Commandments were also given at the same time, right?
Right, right. And
But
we'll
we still follow them.
and we will get into that. There's a video
Okay.
that speaks about that. But that is a very good point. And that stands out like a sore thumb for sure. So then you have Palestinian and Davidic, and the Davidic covenant, a promise to always have someone ruling on your throne. That's revealed through Jesus. And so there's all kinds of promises and provisions. And most of them looks like are conditional. I'm not sure if any are unconditional, but a few questions here, and then we're going to pop into another video that's going to answer a lot of questions. So who initiates these covenants? Who writes up the covenant, so to speak?
God?
Yeah, simple answer. So God thinks up the covenants. And let's think about what this covenant is. When any covenant is made, it's related to how two people or two parties will get along. And so every covenant here is God saying, I want to interact with you, but because God is holy, he sets up conditions so they can interact in a good and God-honoring way. And so the first thing about covenants is that they're a setup for a relationship. And so we have a marriage covenant now. And so when Don and I got married, we took certain vows about how we will get along and treat each other. And so the covenants are two parties, God and his people, and they're the conditions on which this covenant stays in place and how they can get along. How do you stay in my good graces? Well, here's some things I expect. And then here's some blessings if you follow through. So it's considering the holiness of God, but it's also enjoying God with all the blessings that come with serving him. Any thoughts on that? So,
I don't know. I guess
Oh.
the video will help with some clarification.
Yeah, because you're still thinking of that Mosaic covenant.
Yeah,
And I
I'm
just,
still thinking about all of the Old Testament then, in
yeah,
that case.
yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that the covenants change, and sometimes that throws us off. And so when one covenant gets screwed up, God, instead of wiping everyone out, forms a new covenant. Okay, we'll do a new covenant, and this is how we'll get along. This is what I expect of you. These are the blessings that'll come as we relate to each other in the certain way that we'll talk about, and that He'll reveal. So
Covenant starts then, does it end the previous covenant?
yes,
But
unless it looks forward to a future fulfillment. But if it does, then it'll be mentioned.
because now we have the new covenant, but we also still, should live by the Ten Commandments, although that's the law, and that's not gonna save us, Jesus is.
Yeah.
But the
So that is interesting. So we'll play the Shriner video in a second. That'll really bring some clarity. And I won't steal his thunder as much as it's tempting. So I think we'll get into that. The main thing to realize is that God established several covenants. He did them in order that we would know how to relate to him, that he could reveal himself, his will, his wishes, how to please him. And he also gave us a list of blessings that he promises to us. And when he promises, like to Adam, that someone will come and take care of sin, well, then he's going to fulfill that in a future covenant. And that, of course, is through the new covenant or regeneration. And there's elements of Abraham believing God and that credited to him as righteousness. That's fulfilled completely in grace through faith. And then you have the Davidic covenant, David, where he's promised a successor to the throne. That's fulfilled in Jesus. So even though the rule of Israel is no longer done the same way, it's not the place where you can find God. The promises of that covenant don't go away if they're eternal promises. Anyway, so there is 8 covenants. Now, normally there'll be a reference to 5 covenants, but it's good for this class to show them all and to give kind of an idea of how God relates to men through covenants. Now, if there's no covenant, we don't have a relationship with God. So that just shows how important it is to have these covenants, because otherwise there's no terms of being able to get along. It's like if you want to hire a lawyer, well, you got to sign a paper in how you're going to agree, how much you'll pay, what the benefits are. If there's no signed covenant, then you can't relate to each other. So God always has a covenant in place when he's going to relate with people. So that's something that's kind of an interesting takeaway. So let's go to Thomas Schreiner, and he's got a book, by the way, on the end times and Revelation. That's as good as anything I've ever read. It is absolutely phenomenal. If you want the name of that, let me know. I think it's A Joy of Hearing is what it's called. So that's absolutely fantastic. Okay, so you guys can see this skinny professor here in the picture.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to rewind this to the beginning, and here's Thomas Schreiner, one of the top theologians ever. So here we go.
when it comes to applying the Bible today, there are many, many commandments in the Bible. And
Oops. Sorry. He's writing on this slide.
should Christians obey them all? We think of all these commands, for instance, in the Old Testament. And some people charge us as Christians with being inconsistent. They'll say, you follow the commandments you happen to agree with, but many other commandments in the Bible you choose to ignore. For example, the Bible says don't wear a garment with two different kinds of cloth. So don't wear a garment with polyester and cotton. We have all kinds of commands like this in the Bible. Don't boil a goat in its mother's mouth. I mean, nobody thinks about that command. Maybe some of you haven't even heard of that command. So clearly, I would say as a Christian, we're not the first Christians to think about these things. Clearly, Christians have argued, even if you're not aware of this, no, we're not required to obey all the commands in Scripture. So the question is that arbitrary? Is that whimsical? Do we have a reason? Do we have a foundation for what we're saying? And I'd say we do have a reason. We do have a foundation. There's a good reason. And that good reason is we have to read the Bible in terms of its storyline. We have to read the Bible in terms of its covenantal development. So there are many covenants mentioned in the Bible, but for our purposes here, there's an old covenant made with Israel. That covenant made with Israel, they had certain requirements. And those requirements that were given to Israel set them apart from the nations. It distinguished Israel from the nations. So we have an old covenant, and then we have a new covenant in Jesus Christ. That new covenant is prophesied in Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, other passages as well. When we read the whole Bible, when we read the old covenant in light of the new, we see that old covenant has passed away. Christians are no longer under the old covenant. They are no longer under the stipulations, the commands, the prescriptions in that old covenant. The new covenant is new. So none of the commands, I would argue, none of the commands in the Old Testament are binding in and of themselves, because that whole covenant has passed away as a package. We're under the new covenant entirely. So really the question is, why do we keep any of the commands of the Old Covenant? Not why do we avoid some, but why do we keep some of them? And we do keep some of them, don't we? Some of them are repeated in the New Testament. Don't commit adultery. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't lie. And some other commandments as well. Is there a rationale in what the New Testament writers are doing? And I think the most helpful way to think of it actually is the New Testament writers, I think, argue that we are under now what Paul calls the law of Christ in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 and 21. We're not under the law of Moses, we're under the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ fundamentally? Galatians 5:14, the law of Christ is the law of love. And that's what Jesus taught too. That's in Paul, Galatians, where Jesus taught, Matthew 22. How do you summarize what the law is about ethically? It's about loving God and loving your neighbor. And then both Jesus and Paul and other New Testament writers unpack what that love is. What does love look like? Well, if you love, you honor your father and mother. If you love, you don't steal. If you love, you don't murder, and you don't commit adultery. So some of those commands, it's not surprising, is it? Some of those commands in the Old Testament pass over. Some of those commands, they're still required for today, but they're not required because they're part of the Old Covenant. They're required because the New Testament indicates that they're part of the law of Christ. So I think actually when we read the scripture, we're not being arbitrary. We're not being whimsical. We're not just picking up the things we want to obey. We're actually being faithful. We're being faithful to what the Bible as a whole teaches us. We're reading the Bible in light of the whole story, in light of the fulfillment that's in Jesus Christ. The nation of Israel was intended to be enforced for a certain period of time. It was a state and a church. But now the Church of Jesus Christ is in every nation and every people group. And the commands, the laws that are required, they're different than the laws for a small little nation that was a political and church entity. What God requires of us in the new covenant is clear. I mean, it's fundamentally, what he fundamentally calls us to is to love one another. It's pretty remarkable when we read the New Testament. The New Testament isn't filled with detailed regulations. The New Testament focuses on love of God and love of neighbor, and then kind of sketches in for us, okay, here's what love looks like in broad strokes. But we're fundamentally called upon to imitate Jesus Christ, to follow in his footsteps. We see what the love of God is like in the cross of Jesus Christ and his self-giving love for others. And that's what God calls us to as Christians.
Thanks for watching Honest Answers. It's a go.
Let's see how we can.
The Ten Commandments are still valid, but it's because it's under the law of Christ.
Yes. Let me see. I'll get a different screen up.
Because it's loving to not murder your parents
Yeah, pretty much.
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Trying to get this screen to behave here. How do I get this screen to go? Oh, stop sharing. Okay. I forgot how to do this for a second. All right. So yeah, you see that the old covenant, and we'll just speak of one of the covenants, the Mosaic covenant, because that's where most of the confusion is. The laws of Moses, the Ten Commandments, and regulations about how we worship. That's where most of the confusion comes in. And so when God makes a new covenant and he gives us the law of Christ, he doesn't have to take any of those old stipulations, but he takes what is good for us and what is loving toward God and toward each other because they make sense and they're a part of what God loves. So let's just think this through for a little bit. There's in the law of Moses, there's two different kinds of laws. The church and state were mixed together. And so he gave us ceremonial laws, he gave us moral laws, and civil laws. So the ceremonies were all about the temple and maintaining the temple. And so that includes tithing, the Sabbath, sacrifices, clean and unclean, and a whole list of regulations to upkeep the ceremony. And the ceremonies that were held in the temple that were organized around feasts and Sabbath worship and so forth. And then you have moral laws: don't steal, don't kill, don't. And he put those moral laws in place because, you know, they're a part of God's character. It's how he wants people to treat each other, and that doesn't change. The civil laws, you know, the laws about property and how you treat neighbors and what rules there are, the curfews there might be, you know, how you pay, how you put someone in jail for not paying back a loan. There's all these things about running the state and the government. So there's civil laws. That's like the civil code or penal code for us. There's moral laws. How do we treat each other? There's ceremonial laws. The ceremony laws are all gone. We don't have a temple to go to. We don't have to bring the kind of tithes, which were 24%, not 10%, 24%. So we don't have to bring 24% to the temple like they did back then. We mentioned the tithe, and it sounds like it's right, but it actually, the tithe, there's several tithes, and we add it all up, it's 24%. Because they had to run the priest class, the ceremonies, and they had to pay for roads and all this kind of stuff, and run a government and police and all this stuff, and judges. And then they had to, you know, take care of feeding Levites and the priests and the worshipers and all this stuff. So there's all kinds of tithes, and so the tithe is gone because it just doesn't apply. We don't have the same kind of system. So when you see Paul renewing something from the old covenant, it just means that it fits into the law of Christ. So now in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, he tells us how to give, to set aside a part of our income, do it intentionally, and do it in keeping with your income. So if you get a raise, set aside more. And then it talks in the same text about settling in your heart. So the legalistic 10%, thinking that that's automatically what we hit, and then God has to unlock blessings. It's not in the new covenant. It's not in the law of Christ. Will God bless people who are faithful? Of course he will. But it's not magic. And then you have the moral laws, which are all renewed in Ephesians and Galatians. Don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery, so forth. And then you ask yourself, well, is it loving to steal? No. Well, the law of Christ is to be loving, and so we don't steal. And, all of the moral prohibitions, almost all of them from the Old Testament, the normal ones, how we treat each other, they're repeated. So there's laws against homosexuality. They're clearly stated and repeated in the New Testament. There's laws about cohabiting. There's laws about polygamy. Each person should have their own wife. So it's one husband, one wife, no matter what they're showing on TV. That's not our way. It's not loving. It always compromises love in some way. And so we can make sense of why God renewed these things, because they're a good way to love God and love each other. And they're all set forth. Most of
Okay.
the moral laws. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes, I think I got it. Okay. So
Kapowza.
back when they started with the Mosaic Law, it was because it was for a bunch of slaves that were acting like a bunch of hooligans, and they needed a lot of very direct laws and rules in order to treat people well. And
Yeah.
then it got to be so legalistic
Yeah.
that then Jesus came and said, okay, guys, chill out. We need to add a little bit of love into our rules. They're basically the same rules, just like rewritten in a nicer manner.
Yeah, some of them were. There, one
Okay.
classification of them was, and the one classification was the moral law. Most of the
Yeah.
moral laws are carried over. And there's ceremonial laws that are revised. For example, they weren't mandated or stipulated to do the Sabbath anymore. And in 4 passages, it says that the church decided that they would meet on the first day of the week, that Sunday. And it was to honor the resurrection of the Lord. And so there isn't a stipulation that carries over from the old covenant. And a lot of people mix that up. The Sabbath will be forever. Well, it's in a different form now. It's the law of Christ. And we meet to honor him. And so it looks different. And it's being faithful because we love him. So there's some laws that carry over in that way, but the nature of it has changed. But the legalistic stipulations aren't there. They're not in the same way where there's a ritual you do and somehow that makes you clean or you got the check mark or whatnot. So
Well, we have running water now. We don't have to do all that.
yeah, well that probably makes a difference, doesn't it? Yeah, imagine if it was that time of the month and you had to dip in the pool 7 times and go touch a rock out in the ocean or whatever they had to do. I don't
Whatever
know.
weird.
A lot of hoops to jump through. Good grief. Yeah, a lot of similar things for men and different things that can happen. We won't go into it, but anyway. So that's an overview of the covenants. And we covered covenants, and the law is a part of one of the covenants. Let me pull up a page and just see if I missed anything here. But I think we covered it with those videos. That was really helpful. I think it was for me to kind of renew that. Where did you go? Oh, that looks like it. Our cat is howling in the background. I think she watched the movie The Howling.
Yeah.
Okay, so we watched those videos. And let's just see. Yeah, we have some fancy terms that you don't even have to know. Just know that there's civil laws and moral laws and ceremony laws that Israel had. So if you want to do everything in the Old Testament, then you're following rules that weren't even meant, the temple doesn't even exist. And you're following temples for something that doesn't even exist. Let me see, I'll move these lovely people over here. Okay, yeah, we don't have to get into all this. Yeah, so here in this document, I have the three classifications of law: the moral law, and ceremonial laws and civil laws. That's how Israel got in the government. So that is in the document in the teaching guide. And then there's one thing I wanted to point out, and then I think we'll be done. Let's see. Whenever, sorry if I'm making you dizzy here, and I would suggest reading through the teaching guide here to see if I missed anything. But anytime you have a change in covenant, you need two things. This is the last thing I wanted to share. So you need a prophet. So you need someone who speaks for God, and God will reveal the new terms of the new covenant he's establishing. Someone that hears from God. And you need a priest. And a priest is someone who represents the people when they make a sacrifice. So a prophet represents God. The priest represents the people and consecrates the people, and gets their hearts and minds, right, and does ritual purification and initiates the covenant from their end. And the prophet reveals the will of God and what the covenant says. Does that make sense? So a prophet speaks for God. Here's the new covenant. Here's all that you should do in order to have a relationship with me. And then the priest represents the people and says, hey, we agree with this. Here's a sacrifice to memorialize this and, kind of mark it in blood, if you will. And yeah, there's other elements of covenants that I won't really get into because they don't help that much. You also see patterns in covenants. So God speaks in our language, thank God. I wonder how many languages God knows.
All of them.
But yeah, all of them. But he speaks in our language. And so when he made a treaty, like with Abraham, and really all the covenants, you see up to 4 or 5 different elements of the covenant. And so you see a preamble, you see an introduction of the parties. I'm God, I'm the God of Abraham, and so forth. And he introduces himself. I'm the God who brought you out of slavery, and I'm making a covenant with you now. And then you lay out stipulations, and then you lay out blessings and privileges, and then you lay out the punishment for disobeying. So you see these kind of elements in every covenant, and they're right in scripture. You can pick them out if you're looking for it. It's pretty easy to do. And so some of those scriptures I think are in the teaching guide, but you can easily pull that up in a Google search and you'll come up with it. The stipulations of a biblical covenant and or elements of a biblical covenant. And so those are in every covenant. Not every one of those, but you can kind of see he's using legal terms that people are used to, so they know they're getting into a legal contract with God. So that's how he's speaking in our language, that we know, hey, this is serious, boy. It's like we're signing a legal, paper or something. And it's a big deal. So anyway, all right. Questions, thoughts, insights, things that you take away. Going once. Going twice. All right. Well, hopefully that was helpful. That was an introduction. There's sources to dig in a little deeper, but I wanted to really kind of give the nutshell of what a covenant is, what that kind of looks like, that it's how God and people agree to get along in a period of time. And then how do covenants change from one time to the next? What parts of the old covenant, the law, do we still keep? And so I think we covered all that stuff. A lot of stuff to think about, huh?
Sure is.
Pausa. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, then we'll rapture our biscuits out of here.
I like the law of love.
The law of love, the law of Christ. Indeed. Now, some people use the law of love and they say just be loving, like have a positive attitude toward others. But the Bible clearly lays out what it looks like to love other people. It does have some moral requirements that it's loving. It's loving to not steal. It's not loving to perjure yourself or exaggerate or lie about others and so forth. So anyway, all right. I think that's it for now. We'll see you groovy people next time for our last class. And then I think we're going to get into a leadership course because it'll be an excellent time. And I think Ryan might jump back into that. We'll see. But that'll be really excellent material, considering how many Christian ministries a lot of us are involved in. So anyway, all right. Well, good night for now. Love
Good
you,
night.
people. And
Thank you.
we'll catch you soon.
I can figure